Today we want to talk about how we approach the different battles that we face in this life. We're going to be taking our lessons from the life of David and Saul. As many persons know, this was an ongoing battle that David and Saul had. And the battle was forged spiritually before it was even forged physically. Because God had already appointed David to be his servant and to inherit the kingdom of Israel. But the people of God, they chose their own king. And we see in the book of 1 Samuel where Samuel comes to God and says to God that they require a king. And God said to Samuel, they have not rejected you, they have rejected me. And this is important because sometimes we can be requiring something from God, needing something from God. But in so doing, we are rejecting what God has to offer us because of our own understanding and what we deem to be right for us. But it's not right for God. And so we're going to be looking at how do we fight our battles under heavenly instruction. What does that mean? How do we receive instruction from heaven? And how do we identify the instruction from heaven? How does it show itself? And so as we look at the life of David and Saul, we know that the word says that he was a man after God's own heart, being David. And when he came unto Saul and when he dwelt among Saul, Saul kept trying to kill him. Saul kept trying to throw his spear at him. And David perceived that if he did not flee from Saul, he would lose his life. And so sometimes when we are going through our battles, we need to change position. We need to change our physical, but more so our spiritual position. Sometimes we can't change the physical. Sometimes the physical is fixed. And so we have to change ourselves spiritually under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And that is what David did. But in fighting our battles under heavenly instruction, we need to apply heavenly character. What is heavenly character? We see heavenly character being displayed in David. When Saul chased after him, and Saul was constantly trying to find him, to kill him. But every time Saul came close to David, by the providence of God, God allowed David to be above him. But in being above him, God allowed David to show him mercy. And so we see in the cave when Saul fell asleep, David actually cut a piece of Saul's robe. And when Saul left the cave, David said, "Here I am. Is this not your robe?" To show to Saul that the heart that you have against me is not the heart I have against you. And so we realize that in fighting your battles under heavenly instruction, you have to display the heart that God has given you. What is the heart that God has given you towards your enemy? Is it a heart of destruction and wickedness? No, because you see, in fighting your battles under heavenly instruction, God is the one that's actually fighting for you. So you have to show his character in your life. And that was what David was doing. Even when the men around David saw that Saul was asleep, they said, "Yes. Howbeit know the time that God has given your enemy into your hands." And David said, "No, this is not so. I will not touch the Lord's anointed." Because God had already anointed Saul for the kingdom at that time. So you have to be careful in fighting your battles, the counsel that you're taking. Sometimes the very closest persons around you, the counsel that they're giving you is not godly counsel. And David was able to hear from God and know that his behavior would be measured against God's character. And we see it where he even took, on another occasion, the spear from Saul. Saul was asleep and all of Saul's men were around Saul. guarding him. And David went right into that camp while Saul was looking for him and took his spear. He took his spear. This is in 1 Samuel 26. And his water cruse. And then he came out of the trench and called unto Saul and said, Saul, is this not your spear? Is this not your cruse of water? And Saul oftentimes, whenever David spared his life, he would praise David. He would proclaim over David. He would say, you're a better man than I am. He would say that you would do great things. So what God was doing was, in showing mercy to David's enemies, he would let David's enemies bless him. So sometimes you may think that you need to fight your enemy with the same strength and vigor and hatred, but no. Your victory is going to be born in love, and God will allow your very enemies to praise you. And the people around saw David at one point. They said to him, again, God has put your enemy in your hands. And he said, no, he will die in battle. He will go out in battle. David was able to see the end of Saul before Saul could see it himself. And true to that word, Saul went out into battle and died in battle. What does that tell us? It tells us that God will give you the instruction as to the end of your enemy. If you are walking boldly before God with a clean hand and a pure heart, God will let you know the end of your enemy before your enemy knows it themselves. So we see that fighting your battle under heavenly instruction is about being in the will of God. It's about showing the character of God. It's about living up to the standard of God and exalting God in your behavior, even when it is not comprehensible to those around you. They may think, why are you staying in that position? Why are you persevering? Why are you waiting? People don't need to understand the why of your walk with God. What they need to see is the light of God in your walk. The light of God in your wait. The waiting that you're waiting upon God. Because if God has appointed you, if God has decreed something over your life, just as how he decreed it over the life of David, there is no hand, whether in heaven or in earth, that can move that word that he has spoken. Even if God has to shift you physically or shift you spiritually, at the time appointed, when you are faced with your adversary, God will give you the victory over him. God will give you the victory over the circumstance if you persevere in the way that God has instructed you to walk. And so as I close, I pray that you will walk in that victory, walk in that strength and that confidence that heavenly instruction will find you where you are. And in the end, you will be victorious and can say, behold the God of Israel. He has kept his word. He has brought me out of many waters. And I praise and magnify his name.